I'm Charles James Hall. I'm the author of the Millennial Hospitality series. The series, in the series, I attempted to capture my experiences when I was in the Air Force in the middle 1960s. I was born in Wisconsin, and on July 24th, 1964, I entered the U.S. Air Force. I was stationed at Lackland, where I did basic training, and then at Chanute Air Force Base, Illinois, for weather training school. And in March of 1965, I was sent to Nellis Air Force Base, which is just outside Las Vegas, Nevada. And I was there until the 7th of May, 1967, when I shipped out to Vietnam. I returned from Vietnam in May of 1968. I had less than 3 months remaining on my term of enlistment, so the Air Force policy was that I was given an honorable discharge and sent home. While I was at Nellis Air Force Base from 65 until 67, I spent more than 2 of those years out on the Nellis gunnery ranges as the range weather observer. I discovered that out on those bases, out on the ranges, there is a base that the Air Force maintains for aliens. And the Air Force maintains the outer perimeter. There is an inner perimeter, which the aliens maintain, and then everything inside the inner perimeter is treated like an alien embassy. Looking up the valley to the north, the base is in the mountains at the far end of the valley. It's probably 40 miles or so up there. There's 2 mountains up there. The base itself is in the mountain on the east. The alien living area, the living quarters, are underground in the mountains on the west. After I got out of the service in May of '68, I met my wife and married her in May of '69, my wife Marie, and we went to college. We went to school in California. I have a master's degree in nuclear physics, a bachelor's degree in thermal physics, and over the years I also received a master's in business administration from Nova Southeastern University at Fort Lauderdale. During the 80s, when computers finally were good enough so that there were word processors, then I began writing my memoirs for my children and grandchildren. And those memoirs became the Millennial Hospitality series. I found that I wanted to convey to people, especially my children and my grandchildren, how it felt to be the weather observer and to have the aliens come down to where I was and to have to interact with them. Originally, I was part of the rotation pattern. So originally, I was sent up in May of '65 for 6 weeks. The person who replaced me was compromised, and then I was sent to replace him. And in the course of time, the U.S. generals, the American generals, and the aliens formed a committee and decided that they would pick just one observer, and they picked me, and as a committee decision, and that one observer would just be sent all the time and be the range weather observer, win, lose, or draw, no matter what happened. And so therefore, in late '65 and early '66, after the selection process, I was given top secret orders. The orders were that I could go anywhere I wanted out in dreamland. The alien base is actually in Area 54, and the housing area is called Area 53. And dreamland actually, at least at that time, and I presume the same is true today, was Area 53, Area 54, and parts of the Desert Southwest Game Range. When you're physically at Indian Springs and you're looking up the valley, Dreamland includes the mountains on the eastern side of the valley. My orders allowed me to go anywhere I wanted out in Dreamland, day or night, and but I had to do so alone. If I took anyone else out with me, I wouldn't be in any trouble, but the person who was with me might be shot. They would be in serious trouble. When I received my orders, my commanding officer, a major, ordered me to into Nellis and to work the day shift on Sunday. On Sunday, the Nellis weather station is otherwise deserted, and the base operations part of the building is also deserted. And then he came in at noon to the Nellis Base Commander's office, where the Nellis Base Commander and the number 2 man had also come in to deliver the orders which they had received from the Pentagon. And then the MPs escorted the major with my orders in hand over to the weather station. The MPs stayed outside. The major called me in his office, locked all the doors, and read me my orders. The orders began by saying nothing I did would ever be classified, that I could tell anyone I wanted or not tell anyone if I didn't want. I could never be inspected. No one could ever come out or ask me questions. They could listen if I felt like talking, but that was it. He and my chain of command could not come out to the weather station. If there was an emergency and they needed to talk to me, they could only talk to me in the parking lot of the Chow Hall at Indian Springs. If they did so, as soon as they returned back to Nellis, as soon as they got back to the front gate, they had to report immediately to the neurosurgeon for debriefing. On the other hand, I could go and come anywhere I wanted. When he said I could go anywhere in Dreamland, I thought he meant that I could go to sleep on the job, because I didn't know there was a Dreamland. And I was thinking, what a job, you know? When he finished, I wanted to make sure that that was okay, because, you know, the military, you're not supposed to sleep on duty. And so I said to him, I asked him, I said, will there be a cot or a bunk out at the weather station so that I can, you know, sleep? And he looked a little confused, and he said it was his understanding that Dreamland was a place, but that only I would know where that place was. And I thought, you know, he's just trying to be gentle and say, you sleep away, you know? That was the first I'd ever heard tell of Dreamland. In the course of the 2+ years that I spent out on the ranges, the aliens, who are tall and white and have family groups with women and children, would frequently come down to where I was. As the weather observer, my duties were to go out to the ranges Monday through Friday, every day, to take the morning run. The morning run was at 4:30 a.m. To do so, you had to get up at 3 o'clock and drive out there at night, rain or shine. And then you had to fill, you had to start, there was a generator out, 2 generators out there, was 2 diesel generators. You had to start up a generator so that you had some electricity, and it would run the fan on the heater and so on, and the radio and the lights. And then you had to fill up a weather balloon with helium, attach a light, and release it. The children found that very entertaining. It was a pretty balloon with pretty lights. And so the mothers liked to bring the children down to look through my theodolite as I was tracking the balloon. About half the time they came so the kids could play. When I first encountered the aliens, I was terrified, because they're not human, even though they look reasonably human. It probably took me more than 6 months to get over the terror that I felt when they came, even though they had not come to harm me. It's just that being out there at night in the desert and, say, hearing people walking behind your weather shack when you think you're alone, even if they were priests, you'd be afraid, you know. Well, when you discover that they're not human, well, you know, this was the 60s. There was just, you know, it took a long time to get used to it. There was no briefing. The Air Force never said, this is the situation. The aliens never came and said, this is the situation. They never came to teach me anything. They came when they wanted. They left when they wanted. And therefore, it took me a long time to get used to it. Everything I know about the aliens, I had to figure out myself, or occasionally they would answer questions, but not very many, because they came for their purposes, and when they'd finished their purposes, they left. They were really quite friendly, but each one of them was an individual. Interacting with them is sort of like interacting with the people in New York City. There are saints and there are sinners. You know, there are people of all different walks of life and all different viewpoints. And so, you know, I had some that were close friends, like, or almost like brothers, like tour guide, whose life I was credited with saving, and the teacher who credited me with saving her daughter's life. And on the other hand, there were some, like one of the alien generals, that golly, I'm still afraid of him, you know. I mean, if you met him, if he said stand there, you stood there, you know. It was no back talk. The alien doctor who was the doctor that did the medical work on the tour guide, their CIA names, he was just a nice guy, you know. He was the kind of guy that might come up and hug you if you let him. I never did. It freaked me out. But they just came in all different, you know, you had to deal with each one of them as individuals. It took a while to get used to that, and it became a process of getting to know each one to the extent that you dealt with them like people. The base that they have up in Area 54, they use that base the same way that the U.S. Air Force or the U.S. Navy uses their bases, the way the Navy would use a base in the Philippines or on an island in the Pacific. At the base, at the alien base, the tall white deep spacecraft arrive and leave on schedule. And they arrive typically at sundown on the night of the full moon. Because they're gravity powered. They are typically at the base for 2 weeks, and then they leave at midnight on the night of the new moon because they're gravity powered, presuming everything is going well. During those 2 weeks, the spacecraft is refueled and repaired, and the people on board get off and stretch their legs. So at the base, there's a more or less permanent contingent of tall whites who are experienced in dealing with humans and typically who know English. And on the other hand, every 2 weeks, you know, every time a deep spacecraft arrives, there's a contingent of new arrivals, many of whom have never seen humans before. And while the spacecraft is being repaired and refurbished, then the experienced troops, the experienced tall whites, typically take those new arrivals who are brave enough, take them out and show them the town. You take them out and show them what humans are like. And of course, me running my weather station, I'm the test human, you know. And so it was common every time there was a new moon for, you know, after the new arrivals had rested up, for an experienced guard to bring around a group of new arrivals. The number of new arrivals could be anywhere from 2 or 3 to 20, depending on how many were brave enough to come watch Gorilla Charlie in the sagebrush. And so while the spacecraft is being repaired. They also had a technology exchange program with the U.S. Air Force, in which those technologies which they were willing to share with the Air Force, they would work on joint projects with the U.S. Air Force. They were only willing to share technology to the extent that it benefited them. For example, when the spacecraft was in port, they might need spare parts. Those spare parts might include radio equipment. Well, it was easier for them if they could just call up the U.S. Air Force and say, could we buy a new radio, you see? So it was and on the other hand, the Air Force and the Army can always use better radios, you see? And so it was common for them, so one area where they were obviously doing technology transfer was in the area of radio communications, so that we could build radios that they could use, and in return we knew how to build better radios. Some technologies, like the secret to how the secret to how they traveled faster than light, they were not willing to share. The idea of us having our own spacecraft traveling faster than the speed of light with nuclear weapons on board heading for their home planet, they didn't see where that was in their interest. And so when I say they were doing technology transfer with the Air Force, that was a negotiation where both sides mutually agreed that it was in their interest to do so. The tall whites live probably 10 times longer than we do. They live almost 700 years. And their spacecraft clearly travel faster than the speed of light. They're humanoid. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. Throughout much of their adult life, they're the same height that I am, 5'11", 6 feet tall. They have large eyes. Their eyes are perhaps twice as large as ours. They're typically blue, and then blue eyes with white pupils. Although when they get older, especially the men, their eyes take on a pink shade. Their eyes stretch further around the sides of their head than human eyes do, and their ears and their noses are only about half the size of human ears and noses, and their ears lay back along the side of their head more than a human does. Their lips are not as prominent as humans, and they don't have teeth. They just have ridges because they're plant eaters. They don't eat meat. They have much less hair than we do. They don't have any hair on their arms, and the men don't have beards. On their head, they have only about half as much hair as humans, and their hair is so thin and transparent that they appear to be platinum blonde. Okay, sometimes when they keep their hair cut short, sometimes they don't appear to have hair because it's so thin. They're much frail. Their body structure is more frail than ours. The alien whose CIA name was Range 4 Harry, for example, one time I saw him walking in the soft dirt over on the southwest side of the Range 3 lounge, and after he had left, I went over and measured the depths of the footprints he left. And from those, I estimated that he only weighed between 90 and 110 pounds, even though he was the same height as I am. Their bones are only about half as big as ours. Their thumbs are only about half as long, but their fingers are longer in proportion to their hand than ours, and they're way more flexible. But it also means that they're not built for heavy lifting. We're built like gorillas compared to them, you see. They have men, women, and children, and if the men and women are standing side by side and not walking or moving, it's frequently not possible to tell which one is the man, which one is the woman, especially for the young adults. When they get older, then there are obvious differences, but in the facial structure and the bones and stuff. But especially for the young adults, it's entirely possible for two of them to be standing side by side, and if they're not moving, to be not sure if you're talking to men or women. Once they start moving, though, then it's very obvious which ones are the men and which ones are the women, because the men are more like human men. When they walk, they kind of go pound, 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 whereas the women are much lighter on their feet and much more animated. The women are much more like human women, much more willing to talk than the men. It wouldn't be at all unusual for, say, four young men to come around and not have any reason to say anything, and not say anything, to just come around and to just come and not say hello, not say goodbye, not say anything in between, and just stand and look at you. Whereas the women, if they came, usually the women would say something like, typically, is it okay if the children play while you release the balloon? Or usually if you ask the women something, they would have some questions, or at least some conversation. But they never came the tall whites never came just to talk with me. If they were talking with me, it was always as part of the reason they came. The women were very proud of the fact that they loved their children. The men were too, but the women were immensely proud of it. If a tall white lady came and she had children with her, a very common way for her to start the conversation would be for her to ask me, using English, which she had learned, do I understand that they love their children more than human women love their children? Or in other words, I want to make sure my children are safe, you see? And of course, when I said, yes, I understand that, then they would noticeably relax and feel happier. If a tall white lady came with children and she didn't say anything, a common way for me to start the conversation would be for me to say, I understand that you love your children more than human women love their children, and then she'd relax and feel better. In many ways, the tall white women were like female gorillas. Could consider the children to be untouchable, okay? If you touch the children, the mother might kill you, no matter how pleasant she seemed, no matter how close the child came. So, for example, and I speak from direct experience, if I was standing by my theodolite and the child wanted to look through the theodolite and the child was right there, then there's no way in the world that it would be suicide for me to reach over and touch the child. That will upset the mother. And for example, on one evening, this tall white lady came who I had seen a few times before, but she wasn't a regular, and she brought 3 children with her. And she was somewhat older than the typical young adult and therefore somewhat taller. She was 6'1", 6'2", and following the usual so-called protocol, she had come down the Bunker Road with her 3 children in an obvious manner to let me get used to the idea that she was coming with her kids. And then when she got to the end of the Bunker Road where the range boards were, she began approaching me directly. I was halfway across the square. And as she got closer, perhaps 20 feet, 15 feet, even though I'd gotten over my fear of the tall whites, because you had to treat each one as an individual, I found it a little intimidating that she was coming that close. And so I backed away from my theodolite towards the generator shack. And she said, is it okay if the children look in my weather shack while I took my report? And I said yes, and so I backed away to the generator shack and stood with my back to the wall of the generator shack and left her standing just to the northeast of my theodolite and, said, take all the time you want. And so then the 3 children went into my weather shack, like kids do, and they didn't touch anything or move anything, but they were just looking around out of curiosity. And at the time, as she stood there, she was looking at her children who were in the shack. Now, I'm not sure they were all her children. Usually, when the tall white lady came with 3 children, the typical contingent, 1 would be hers and 2 would be the children of someone else. Typically, she'd be babysitting 2 kids and bringing 1 of her own. And so she was watching the children. I became concerned because I had a can of Coca-Cola, which was in a metal can, sitting on one of the shelves. Now, the tall whites wore suits when they came at night that put out a zone of fluorescent light and radioactive particles. The suits protected them from things, like if you threw a rock at them, the rock wouldn't hit them, it would get to that zone and fall to the ground. It also allowed them to levitate, especially the children, but they had to balance themselves when they did so. So the children might use the suits to levitate. The adults usually didn't levitate very much, 9 inches or so, but it worked like an elevator, as I'll describe later. And I became concerned that since the children had their suits on, usually the kids turned off the power to their suits when they went in my shack. And I became afraid that they would get next to that can of Coca-Cola and might be in some danger, in which case I might be blamed, you know. It would have been, it would have been suicide for me to go over to my weather shack and speak to the children. You know, the mother might well have killed me if I'd done that. There's no way in the world you could go over there and say, children, don't do this, children, don't do that. You're just taking your life in your hands to try that. You have to talk to the mother, you know, and that's how the tall whites are. And on the other hand, she wasn't looking at me at the time. And so what I did is I took 2 steps forward and stopped and stood there with my hands at my side and my feet, you know, not moving, and waited for her to see me. And of course, when I took 2 steps forward and stopped, then she looked over where I was immediately. And then when I had her attention, I said, I'm worried about the safety of the children. I have a can of Coca-Cola there in that can, and I'm worried that the children might be in some danger if they get too close to it. And the mother said, I'll handle it. And then the mother obviously communicated with the children, and the children were very well behaved, and they stayed away from my can of soda pop. The children never disobeyed their parents that I ever saw, and the parents would do anything for their children. So when they traveled in family groups, they were very tightly knit. When the women came around, they never came around alone. None of the tall whites ever came around alone. They always came around in groups, and the adults were always well armed. But it was common for the women to be very proud of their family relationships. The men were too, but it was just more common for the women to describe it. So it was very common, say, like if a group of them came around, for the lady to say things like, the guard on the tower is my mother's brother's son, and just identify who all their friends were, if they were, who they were related to and who they weren't related to, and far more so than what humans would do. They did more than just travel in family groups. They appeared to maintain very tightly knit family relationships. The tall whites live approximately 10 times longer than humans live. And they don't age the way we do. When they get throughout most of their adult life, as I said, they're about our height, 5'10", 5'11", 6 feet. But then when they get equivalent in age to a human who's perhaps 39 or 40 years old, and for them that's perhaps 400 years old, then they start growing again. Instead of aging the way we do. As they grow older, they go through several more growth periods. This is not necessarily good for them because only their bones and muscles grow. Their internal organs don't grow in proportion. Pretty soon they get very tall, 8.5 feet tall, but their organs aren't able to support their body. So as they get taller, they become more fragile. Eventually, after 600 or 700 years, or in there somewhere, there comes a growth phase where they begin growing again, and their organs can't support it, in which case they die. Usually by the time they get to be 8 feet tall, they're fragile, and usually aliens that tall are accompanied by younger adults to steady them. Living longer does have some drawbacks. For one thing, their bodies do not heal as quickly as ours. If they break a leg, and they're very fragile, so they break easy, it may take their bones 5 Earth years to heal. Whereas, as you know, a young person, when I was young, if I broke a leg, could heal up in, I don't know, a few weeks or so. I'm not a medical doctor, but would heal up much faster. Cuts and scratches, for example, when I was young one time, for example, and I was out on the ranges, one day I scratched myself in a very ordinary fashion in the morning, By the afternoon, it had already healed up nicely, and by the next day, I'd almost forgotten about it. The next day, a group of tall whites came around with the experienced tall white and some young arrivals, and they were very impressed that my body had already healed. For them, that would have taken several weeks to have healed up like that. Also, although they're considered to be more intelligent than we are because their nervous system runs 2 or 3 times faster than ours does, it does have some drawbacks. They tend to, when they're doing something, they tend to focus in on it more carefully than a human would. And they're therefore very easy to surprise when they're engaged in something. One time when a group of tall whites came around with the usual experienced guard and a group of new arrivals, it was the morning run, and I was young. I was doing what we all do. I was drinking soda pop, I was eating peanuts, I was talking, I was playing to the music. I was doing my balloon. I'd released a balloon and I was tracking my balloon at the theodolite, and I was singing some songs and dancing around too to some Mick Jagger songs, all kind of at the same time while writing down my numbers. And one of the new arrivals asked the experienced guard, are all humans able to do that? Because I was multitasking. The tall whites wouldn't have done it that way. They would have just eaten and concentrated on eating, or they would have just taken the readings and concentrated on the readings, or sang their song and concentrated on singing their song. For that, and so they appreciated, as I did, one of the first agreements that I negotiated with them. We agreed that they wouldn't come up behind me and scare me. They could do so very easily. And I wouldn't come up behind them and scare them. You see, if I saw one of them out in the desert and it didn't appear that he had seen me, that I wouldn't approach him. I would just stay where I was and make a sound or sing one of my songs, such as the song by Ricky Nelson, It's Up to You, because I've done everything, you know. And until I was sure they had seen me. And then I wouldn't approach him. I would just stay where I was. And if they chose to come closer to me, they could approach me as close as they felt until they didn't feel comfortable. An experienced troop might come right up to you 10, 15 feet. A new arrival might stay back out there a quarter mile, because it varied depending on which one you were talking to. On the other hand, if they chose to move away or to run away, I wouldn't pursue. Okay, I would stay where I was, and they could, and they could leave, and they could come whenever they wanted and leave whenever they wanted. The reverse was true. If they were approaching me, and they got too close so that I felt uncomfortable, as in the case of the tall white lady at the theodolite stand, I would back away and they would stay where they were until I had backed away to where I felt comfortable. So that before we began talking, we would first come to a distance where we both felt comfortable, you see. I've always felt that was, and then if I got too uncomfortable, if I felt like going away, they wouldn't pursue. And I felt that was very important in being able to deal with the tall whites, because it allowed both me and the tall white individual, whichever one I was dealing with, to come to a common distance where we were willing to talk to each other. For some, like the teacher or Range 4 Harry, that might be as little as 10 feet. For others, like that tall white general, well, I didn't want him closer than a quarter mile, you know? Yeah, and that was a real important, that was one important agreement that we agreed on. And if I were to see one today out in the desert or out in Indian Springs Valley or out in the town of Indian Springs or whatever, I would still be living by that agreement. I have a master's degree in nuclear physics, and I believe that I figured out how their deep spacecraft worked, at least in general detail. And I copyrighted that in a scientific paper I call Hall Photon Theory. It's included in the appendix of Book 3, Millennial Hospitality 3, The Road Home. I believe their scout craft and their deep spacecraft had a double hull construction. And for example, in the case of the scout craft, in between those two hulls, they had what appeared to be 1,000 miles of fiber optic windings. They built the scout craft using materials supplied them by the U.S. Air Force. The scout craft were clearly built here on this Earth. When you went on board, many of the parts, like the seats, still had the mold markings of American manufacturers like Lockheed, Boeing, the overhead compartments by Airstream, and so on. And so therefore, it had to be perfectly possible to build a scout craft with its anti-gravity drive using ordinary American parts. The scout craft had the fiber optics windings came in several sets, and the way it worked is it worked in a manner philosophically the same as an electromagnet. It's just that they did not, in an electromagnet you use electrons on going down copper wires and coils. Instead, instead of electrons, they used some other subatomic particle. I'm not sure which one. It's my understanding that there are 3 different ones, or maybe 5 different ones, perhaps mesons or bosons or those subatomic particles, and then that put out anti-gravity. The particle generators looked like batteries, where there was one that would create the particles and accelerate them into the fiber optics, and then the fiber optics amplified the anti-gravity field the same way that an electromagnet amplifies the electric field or the magnetic field. And then there was another one that picked up the particles. Of course, they had to be refueled after, they had to be recharged just the way a battery has to be recharged. The same technology was used on their suits, the ones that allowed them to levitate. And if they were running the suit at full power and they came out from their rest area at 11:30 at night, then by 5:30 in the morning, the suit was almost out of power. So that the batteries they had on their suits would only last 6 hours or so. The batteries on the deep spacecraft obviously also had a limit to how long, had to be recharged periodically, although I'm not sure how long that limit was, but it perhaps depended on the craft. The deep spacecraft would arrive and leave on schedule, and the shortest schedule was 2.5 months. The longest schedule that I saw was 5 years. So they had to be able to carry fuel to recharge the batteries for that long, or their technology had to allow the batteries to be recharged for that long. But they did have to be recharged. You did have to periodically stop and put in a new power source. The outer set of coils served to streamline the craft for travel within space itself. And when the outer set of coils were powered up, it also protected them from the forces of acceleration and deceleration. As I described in Book 2, it was common to see the scout craft, if it were sitting out in the desert some distance, and perhaps, say, 3 miles, when it was sitting there unpowered, it would just look like a white ellipsoid with windows and the way you'd expect. When they powered up the outer set of coils, it would take on a fuzzy appearance. The outer field obviously protected them from radiation in space as well. Then when they lifted up off the desert, if they had the outer coils energized, they were capable of tremendous performance. It was common to see the scout craft accelerate from 0 to 8,000 miles an hour, travel just a short distance, like 7 miles or 10 miles, stop and set down again, and then turn off the coils. The people on board didn't belt themselves in, they just sat in chairs the way we do, because they didn't feel the force of acceleration. If they did not have the coils powered up, however, if they were bringing the scout craft in real close, like if they were going to park it beside the Range 3 lounge, they would turn off the outer set of coils while they were still some distance away, because the field coming off that outer set of coils extended a great distance from the craft. Of course, before they turned off the coils, they would first slow to maybe 3 or 5 miles an hour, and then once they turned off the coils, then they drove it like a baby buggy, okay? Then they just came in real slow and landed like at 2 or 3 miles an hour. And when they took off, if they hadn't charged up the coils, then they would be traveling just 2 or 3 miles an hour. They'd be traveling like a baby buggy. And they wouldn't, but it wasn't until they'd powered up that other set of coils that they would start doing high-speed performance. Powering up the coils took a little while, just like turning on an electromagnet. It was common for it to take as long as 10 seconds for the coils to power up. Because the particles that are running through the fiber optics are subatomic particles that do decay, the coils would heat up if you ran at full power for too long. And the tall whites were always very conscious of the temperature of the coils. And therefore, it was very common to see them when they sat down on the desert, on occasion, especially on hot days, to get out and open up the panels on the outside of the deep space, on the outside of the scout craft, obviously just letting the coils cool off. It doesn't mean the coils were necessarily too hot, but they liked the coils running cold, and they were always very conscious of the coil temperature. On that day, that scout craft suffered a meltdown of the fiber optics. Now that, as I remember, was a Wednesday, and they worked on that craft from Wednesday, 24 hours a day, till the following Monday morning, just getting enough coils repaired so that they could lift off and take it back to the base. And in order to take it back to the base, they had to bring out 2 extra scout craft. In the meantime, they'd brought out several others with mechanics and stuff. And they had to nurse it back to base by running 2 extra scout craft on each side, just to get it back to base where they could fiddle with the coils. Recovering from a coil meltdown was obviously a big problem for them. I never saw any humans working on the coils. The tall whites were I never saw any Air Force personnel or anybody out there with them. The tall whites always reserved the option, or anything to do with the coils, they always wanted only tall whites on there. As far as I know, I'm the only human that got anywhere close to the coils. I got to within a few hundred feet before their guard blocked my way and made it clear that he didn't want me to go any closer. It might have been because, since they're running subatomic particles, maybe he was just concerned about the radioactive fields coming off it, but he didn't want me up there touching them or anything, you know. I've been on board the Scout craft, but not on board the deep spacecraft. The deep spacecraft, which are the same design and the same technology but much larger, are titanium black, right? The one that came in damaged with meteor damage. I got closer to that one than any of the other deep spacecraft. That one I got within a few hundred feet of as it came by me in the snowstorm. And so I did see a great deal about the deep spacecraft, but the only creatures I ever saw in the deep spacecraft were the tall whites themselves. On the Scout craft, however, it was common to see American U.S. Air Force generals on the Scout craft along with their tall white counterparts. That was very common, and I myself was on the Scout craft. However, they never came to just take me for a joyride. You know, they never came to say, oh, let me show you the sun and the moon and the stars. I don't know, maybe they would have if I'd asked them, but they knew that we had rank and that I was an enlisted man, the lowest of the low. You know, if there's a latrine to be cleaned, I'll be the one doing the work. And they were well aware that generals who show up with 4 stars were given the orders, and I was pretty much taking them, you know. So it's not like they, you know, and it's not like they ever came purely to entertain me with their scout craft. On that occasion, when I was on board their scout craft, remember they had several new arrivals who were part of the technology transfer, and their motivation for taking me on the board the scout craft on that particular day appeared to be that the new arrivals who were afraid of me had to practice coming up to Charlie and saying, "Hello, Charlie," and then and then once having gotten to within 10 feet of the gorilla, then they would back away and stay out there like 20 feet. They'd so bravely faced me down in the sagebrush, I guess. But I guess what they were thinking of, I believe what they were thinking of on that day is that they were going to suggest to the American generals additional technology exchange projects, and I think they were using me as the test guinea pig to take me on board the scout craft and show me their living quarter, show me what was on board the scout craft, and then they could test my reaction to what I thought was good and what I thought was, you know, what I was impressed with and what I wasn't with. And then I think they were saying, therefore, then when they went and talked to the American generals, they could say, "We'll make this better for you and that not so good for you." Or, you know, "We'll make this better for you, we can help you here." The scout craft was made completely out of American parts and looked like an RV trailer. When you went on board, it was ellipsoidal, and the scout craft was white with windows on both sides. And more windows. The door, when you looked at the front of when you were standing looking at the front of the scout craft, the door was on that craft was on the right. Since they were all made here, there was a number of different variations in the design, and the windows on that side extended further back than on the left side. There were no windows on the back, none on the top, none on the bottom, and only one door, the one on the right, which opened from the top, and much like a Learjet, or some Learjets. When you went on board, there was a bulkhead about a third of the way back. In front of the bulkhead on all the scout craft, the design was the same. There were 5 seats without seat belts that you just sat in. Those tall whites are not built strong like we are, and so the idea of belting themselves in would damage their bodies. There was 2 seats for the pilot and the co-pilot, and then 3 other seats in the front. And they weren't very interested in showing me the cockpit area. They said there wasn't much about it that I would understand anyway. On the bulkhead, there was a set of panels. Nowadays, we consider it old hat, switches that don't move like you have on microwave ovens. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde, even though I realized that the first motionless switch was actually copyrighted in more or less about 1929, but they weren't in common use. On each switch there were a set of icons. Now we consider that old hat too, because you buy your car and there's icons. But in the 60s that was considered pretty avant-garde. The icons were pretty ordinary. One controlled the outside lights and it looked like the sun. One controlled the inside lights. And so in terms of the icons, there wasn't, or the hieroglyphs on the switches, they weren't very different than, say, hieroglyphs on the Egyptian pyramids or the icons that you see on a modern-day automobile. Behind the bulkhead, there were at least 3 or 4 different designs depending on which model of the scout craft you were looking at. In the RV model, the one that on that day that I was on, what was behind the bulkhead was an ordinary RV. When you went in there and you were looking towards the back, on the right there was a microwave oven, only where the aliens had taken off the mechanical door and put on a different cover with coils around it. And then when they turned on the oven, they first turned on the coils, and the coils put out the standard field and prevented the microwaves from going through that field into the room beyond. So it looked like a little cave where you'd turn it on and then turn it off, and you didn't have to fiddle with the door, you see. In the back was the latrine, just like in an RV. On the left, they had the seats where you would eat, but also they had hammocks where the children would sleep. And then they had the overhead compartments and a few storage things in the back, although not a great many of them. And then on the bulkhead in the front, they had a mirror and a makeup table where the teacher would put on her stuff. And it was all pretty ordinary. That was the RV model. My website is millennialhospitality.net, where I have additional information relating to my books and the Millennial Hospitality series. The number of tall white aliens at the base varied somewhat depending on how many deep spacecraft were in port. However, as I describe in Book 3 in the chapter entitled The End of Innocence, on one night I saw between 200 and 300 different tall white individuals. There were so many I couldn't count them. Lined up along the mountains to the east of, up along where the ammunition bunker was. On the night that the tall white lady known as Pamela was supposed to finish her final exam to be head of the technology transfer team to go into Livermore. On that night, as I describe in my book, she panicked and failed, but in amongst those 200 or 300 tall whites, and that's just an estimate because I couldn't, it was a crowd of people and I couldn't count them all. There were also American Air Force personnel, nobody below the rank of colonel. There was like a 4-star general, a 3-star general. There were several of them. There were also several American government people in civilian clothing over there. The tall white individuals that they were talking to appeared to come from all walks of life. Some of the tall whites were clearly the tall white equivalent of generals. Others were clearly the equivalent of tall white civilian government people. But there were an awful lot of tall whites who weren't obviously part of the military, but were just women and children. At one point, for example, the tall white lady whose CIA name was the teacher was standing out in front of the line with a group of children around her and was pointing out the position of the balloon that I had released and where it was in the sky for them to all watch the balloon floating. And so the tall whites had a social structure, a division of labor, very similar to our own. And so some were military people, some were medical people, and they had personalities accordingly. On that night, there were, I counted between 35 and 50, perhaps as many as 75 scout craft that had parked in the part of the desert that I had dubbed the parking area. There were so many I lost count of the number of, I couldn't count them all. But I estimated that somewhere between 35 and 50 was a reasonable count, but there may have been 75. So the number of tall white individuals and scout craft, was at least that large. I have no idea if that was everybody on the base that had come down or if what percentage that was, but the number of people that you could see, the number of individuals that you could come across was at least in that numeric range. The number, when they came around to where I was, they came around, the kinds of individuals that came around were from all walks of life. And the tall white doctor came around and the tall whites he brought with him appeared to be medical students. They had no interest in the mechanical aspects of what I was doing, although the doctor, like a human doctor, he cared only about the humanistic aspects. On the other hand, on a different night, one of the tall white guards brought around 3 young adult tall white men who were clearly electrical engineers. One of the tall white individuals that I was reasonably good friends with called himself co-pilot, but he was very proud of his ability to repair the scout craft, and he wanted to have been called the mechanic, but I guess the name was taken, and so he had to pick a different name, Another one was called the captain. He didn't appear to understand humans very well, and he didn't appear to want to. He appeared to just want to come and do whatever he had to do, and then if whatever you were for humans, well, that was you, and go on about his business. Whereas the doctor, described in The Wayward Wind, he wanted to come and really understand humans. What are they like, you see? Others, like the tall white general that I previously referred to, the idea of him understanding anybody, that he didn't care to understand anybody. He came to give the orders, and you were there to take them, you know? And if you liked him, fine. If you didn't like him, fine. But, you know, he was the general. They were all like that. The teacher was there and with the guards, and the children were playing on the steps of the control tower. And I walked over close to her, 10 feet or so, and on that night she was willing to answer a few questions. And I asked what she thought of humans and the planet Earth. I asked her how it compared with other inhabited planets that they had seen. And she said that they considered the Earth to be a cold, desolate wilderness. On the other hand, she said the thing that they found unique about humans is our willingness to do things with animals. Her example was that I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. I feel very comfortable milking cows, riding horses, making, you know, pets with dogs. Yet each of those animals could kill me if they wanted to. I don't think of it that way because instead, like all humans, I first try to decide how the animal is thinking, and then I approach the animal accordingly. So I calm down the horse by speaking to it nicely and approaching it from the front. I put the cow in a stanchion and calm it down and begin milking. I make friends with the dog by feeding it and patting it on its head. She said that they considered that to be very unusual. She said that on most inhabited planets, once the a group of intelligent people evolved, they had no interest in dealing with the less intelligent animals and usually just killed them all off. You know, they had no intent. That she pointed out that I felt comfortable with pets of cows, making pets of dogs, making pets of, you know. She referred to the time a few days earlier that I'd been down playing with some of the dogs that really weren't my dogs, but from people that lived in the housing area, feeding them and teaching them to roll over and sit up. She said usually the intelligent people just, you know, don't care what the dog thinks, just shoots them, you know. And they found humans to be very unusual in that regard. And the way she described it is because we were willing, even though we were intelligent, we were willing to try to think like less intelligent animals. Okay. They always came armed. Now the children weren't armed, and the adults that were very old typically weren't armed. But the young adults and the adults that weren't too fragile, they always came armed. Their weapons typically appeared to be look like white pencils with a certain squarish cross section. The young adults typically carried weapons that were perhaps 6 inches long. The older adults typically carried weapons that were longer, presumably with greater power. The weapon worked like a microwave laser. The weapon could be adjusted for frequencies appropriate for different elements. If they adjusted it for the frequency of sodium, for example, in the human nerves there are sodium atoms and calcium atoms. And if they adjusted it for sodium and fired it at you, it would make it seem like you were getting an electric shock. Like, you know, depending on the power of the weapon, it would feel like you just touched a high voltage wire of 100,000 volts and was extremely painful. If they set it high enough, they could kill you by just going zappo and you'd be electrocuted. If they had it set low, then it would just give a tingling affair, and you know. They never actually used the sodium setting on me, but I did meet, for example, a CIA guard who said that one day he had been walking with the teacher coming down the steps of the Capitol building. And because their bone structure is slightly different than ours, he wasn't familiar with the way they look when they're walking down steps. And he said they were partway down, and it looked to him like the teacher was going to fall. And so without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her by the elbow to steady her. And he said she almost killed him. She jerked the weapon, set it to the sodium setting, and had him down on his knees saying, "You think we're fools? You think we're idiots? You think I'd come here if I couldn't take care of myself?" And she said, you know, it was all he could do to breathe when she used that weapon on him, and he was absolutely terrified of her. You know, she put him through 5 or 10 minutes of, you know, who's giving the orders and who's taking them, you know, and it was nothing but yes ma'am, no ma'am. And and they never did that to me, although in addition to the guard, I met a number of guys they had done that to. Another set, if they moved it to the calcium setting, then it was like putting you to sleep or calming you down. So like if you were standing there and they did it to you, you might not be able to move your feet, but you wouldn't actually feel terrified. They didn't use the calcium setting very often. One of the weapons they could set to hypnotize a person. When they used that setting, they typically liked a clean shot at one of your temples. And what it would do is induce the same as if you were hypnotized. They could turn it on instantaneously and turn it off instantaneously. And it was common to have missing time experiences. One day I was walking from my theodolite stand to the weather shack. It happened a large number of times, but on this day in particular. And it was like 19 or 20 steps from the theodolite stand to my weather shack. And I could clearly remember taking step 12. And I could clearly remember finishing step 14. But in between those two steps, almost 20 minutes went by. You know, it used to annoy me greatly until I'd finally gotten to where I could break through that hypnotism by relaxing and letting your mind wander. And what had happened was, it was one of the early days in '65. Range 4 Harry had brought some new arrivals around, and he had stepped out from the alleyway between my weather shack and the supply shed and had a clean shot at my right temple and hypnotized me as I was taking step 13. And then while I stood there, he'd brought out the new arrivals and said, "This is Charlie. See, he's got teeth. Open your mouth, Charlie." Just like you do when you're hypnotized. And said he eats more times than we do, and, you know, giving him the tour, this is what a human is. And then when they all went back in, then he's, you know, really, it took him about 20 minutes to go through his introducing them to a human routine, and then released it, and then went on, you know. Because of a number of episodes like that, I used to have a policy of writing the time down when I did things. So I used to have a policy of writing down the time, and before I started walking back to my weather shack, of writing down on my weather report, so, you know, when I left the theodolite stand, and then writing down on my weather report when I got to my weather shack. And of course it should only be like a minute or two, you see, you know, and just to see if they'd done that to me, and I didn't remember it because they could do it so quickly. I'll say one more thing about the weapons. They had another setting that I know about, the iodine setting. And if they hit you with the iodine setting, especially in the thyroid area, it would affect the iodine in your blood, and it would alter the chemistry of the blood so that your blood would seep through the arteries, and you'd bleed to death in like 2 minutes. Now, nothing I did was ever classified. Nobody ever gave me a briefing before I went out there, and nobody ever gave me a briefing when I came back. My orders said that nothing I did was ever classified. I was never part of a project. We were never building like airplanes or missiles, so therefore I was never shown any classified drawings or anything like that. Everything I know I had to figure out for myself. There's a good reason for that. The aliens don't handle anger the way humans do. When they become angry, you know, they either go away or they kill you, or, you know, there's, humans, you know, we get angry with each other and we fight and then we become good friends. The aliens, at least where humans are concerned, or at least my experience is, aren't like that. They're either pleasant or you're in trouble. If I didn't bring anything off the ranges, I didn't bring any photographs, any documents, any material. I came off only with my memories. There was nothing to debrief me on. The alien mothers, remember, are very proud of their ability to raise their children. If anything I did was classified, that would mean, for example, that after the teacher brought her daughter and her her daughter's playmates around to simply play, then I would have had to have been called in and be debriefed by CIA guards. That would have upset the teacher beyond limit. To have two ordinary human guards call me in and start asking questions. How does the teacher take care of her children? Do you think she's doing a good job? Do you think? I mean, and you wouldn't have had to tell her. The next time I went out there, using their communication equipment, she would have just said, she would have just figured it right out. Or the next time the generals showed up, she'd have just figured it right out. Well, remember the experience of that CIA guard on the steps of that he related to me on the steps of the Capitol building. The idea of upsetting the teacher, I mean, she was perfectly willing to just jerk the weapon and say, who's given the orders? I thought we had an agreement, you know. The committee had agreed, which included the teacher, Range 4 Harry, some of the other tall whites, as well as the American generals. They had agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified, and the tall whites expect their agreements to be carried out, just like Philadelphia lawyers, to the letter. They go through a lot of trouble. They are very conscious of their agreements, and they keep them to the letter, and they expect the same from humans. 40 years isn't much time for the tall whites, since they live so much longer than we do. If anything I did was classified, they agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified. They meant that, period, you know, and they meant the American generals to keep that period, you know. And after all, I don't have any drawings or pictures. I didn't, you know, the log books that were out there, I left out there. And so there were, you know, usually classification refers to material things, you know, drawings, material, whatever. When I was out there, I never observed the aliens to do anything magical. They were very good at building craft that traveled faster than the speed of light. They did not travel in time. I never observed them traveling to another dimension. I never saw, I mean, they're not angels, they're just creatures like us. That I'm very religious, I'm Roman Catholic, that angels are angels and aliens are aliens. They did not come to teach me anything. They came for their purposes. They didn't, currently it seems to me that American physics is kind of in the reverse Galileo position. In the time of Galileo, religious leaders required that scientists think inside the box, and scientists like Galileo wanted to experiment and think outside the box. Now, however, the situation appears to be reversed. American physicists seem to think that Einstein was always and forever perfect and complete, and so American scientists keep thinking inside the box. In Hall photon theory, my belief is that inside the photon there is a third field, but currently the box says there's only two fields. Most scientists won't consider it. They're insisting on thinking inside the box for religious reasons, pretending it's science, you see. As I describe in the appendix of Book 3, I show in a scientific manner how scientists should be approaching that. Currently, it's the religious leaders who are willing to consider guys like Monsignor Balducci, I believe, and so on, who are willing to think outside the box and say, of course, there can be intelligent life on other planets. One of the biggest shocks that I had to overcome in 1965 and 66 was once I realized that they were real, they were here, and that Einstein was wrong, and that God created life on many, similar to us, on a whole bunch of different planets. It was the shock of realizing that so many people had been so wrong for so long, you know? I mean, once you saw their craft come in, defeated, floating on the gravity field in perfect silence and landing, it was the shock of saying, how could so many American scientists not have discovered that, or not even be trying to discover it, not even be thinking about that. And likewise, from a religious point of view, it seems the teacher herself, one time on a different night when I went over there and I was talking to her, and she was willing to answer a few questions. She was teasing me because they have a dry sense of humor, and they liked to outthink me, and they could do so very quickly or very easily. And she said, and I was saying, she was making a long story short. She was pointing up to the stars in the sky, and she said, "You can see all the stars in the sky. Surely you didn't think you were alone." And at the time, I had, you know. And then they were all laughing, you know. Surely you didn't think that whatever life was on the Earth wouldn't be repeated on the other stars, you know. And I had, and then they were all laughing. Boy, is he silly, you know. And it just seems so obvious to me when you go out at night and you look up at the stars of the sky, that however whatever God did to make life here on Earth, he must have done it again, because there are so many stars in the universe and it's so vast. And religious leaders are willing to think outside the box. Whereas now when I go and I talk to the scientists and stuff, they all start with this box called Einstein. Einstein himself never claimed to be perfect and complete, but all of his followers seem to claim that he was perfect and complete. And I think that's one of my observations is that box they're in. Well, remember when the teacher said that on other planets the intelligent beings typically killed off the animals, she was referring to other planets she had seen with intelligent life on them, but she didn't elaborate. And the reason is because when they came for their purposes. They didn't come to say, "Let me tell Charlie everything there is to know about the universe." They didn't care. If they didn't have anything to say, some nights they might just come and not say anything. The kids might play and they might leave, you know. Especially the men. If there was no reason for them to actually come and talk, when they were close, like that night when there were the 3 electrical engineers there. They wanted to see me start up the electrical generator because that's the same kind of power source the U.S. Air Force had given them for use up on their hangar, because it was built by the Air Force. And they wanted to see how I used it as part of their training program, see? Well, from their point of view, there's no reason to talk to me about it. They just want to see me do it. So they came and just stood there and watched. And then, you know, eventually Charlie's bright enough to figure out that I should just carry on with my duties, and they would just stand and watch. And then, you know, if there had been a reason for them to say, "What does this do?" then they would have said, "What does that do?" But they didn't come and say, "Oh, let me tell you about this star, or let me tell you about that star," or anything like that. One of the things I had to do is put aside the baggage of Hollywood. We all know how Hollywood thinks things are supposed to go. According to Hollywood, when aliens come, there's supposed to be lights in the sky, and they're supposed to be pretty colored and move fast and have clever formations, and then they're supposed to land over there, and somebody's supposed to come out and do weird things. I really wasn't ready in the 60s for the idea that I would just walk around the corner of one of my weather shack, and there would be a man standing there the day I did at Range 1, and he wasn't human, and he was just standing there looking at me, and what he was doing is guarding the play area where the teacher and the children were playing. And you hadn't seen the craft, you hadn't seen the scout craft, you hadn't seen him come, you hadn't seen him leave. There was no reason for him to say anything, because there's no reason for you to know what he's doing there. He's just guarding the entrance to where the kids and the teacher are playing on that day. And if you feel like standing there and looking at him, well, that's fine with him. If you feel like running away, that's fine with him, because he's not human. He sees it differently. And it took me you know, he's not human, he sees it differently. And it took me a while, it took me a very long time, several weeks, to get used to the idea that they are the way they are that way because they like themselves being that way, and that's different than the way Hollywood would have us think they were. And of course, one of the biggest shocks is they were so similar to us in so many ways. They love their children, they have a dry sense of humor, they love to tell jokes and laugh, and they get bored out of their gourd up in the base. One of the common things to talk about with the young, tall white women was fashions. You know, the Air Force provided them with clothes straight out of the Sears catalog. One of the jokes the teacher used to make about the Air Force generals is up on their base, in their commissary, there were some clothes that the generals had picked that they could choose from. And of course, the teacher used to say, well, all the American generals are all old men, so naturally they have no fashion sense, right? You know? And she used to laugh about the fashions that the generals thought they should wear, you see. And one of the things that she and the other young, tall white women wanted to do was to go into town and buy pretty clothes. And of course, we don't think of aliens that way, but when in my weather shack, I used to have a Sears catalog, a Montgomery Ward's catalog, a J.C. Penney's catalog. We had outdoor plumbing, and so I had several copies of the catalogs for several reasons. And one of the things that the young, tall white women used to like to do is to come through and look through my catalogs. And what they'd be looking at are women's clothes. Sometimes when you'd see them out in the desert, or especially on the morning, what they'd be wearing were clearly clothes straight out of the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward's catalog, and they were very, you know, they were as proud of the new clothes as any Earth woman would be. And the teacher was very proud of her ability to dress up and look like a nurse, and it took me a long time to get over the baggage from Hollywood, because every time you look at a Hollywood movie, you know, aliens are supposed to be weird and different, you know. Yeah, and I really, you know, it took me, it was such a shock to have like the teacher walk in with, you know, wearing a new dress that she had bought from Sears and proudly show it off and say, what do you think of my dress, you know? Yeah.